What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. That intro was a little bit strange. This week is episode 28 of the Book Binge, and we're doing the fourth of my Dark Tower reviews, covering the fourth book of the series, Wizard and Glass, with two more reviews for the series coming out this month as well, so stay tuned as we journey forward on the path of the bean. Now, I've heard before that Wizard and Glass is one of those kind of mixed reception kind of books for the series overall, or at the very least, it was when it was released, maybe a little bit less so now. Because around, if I were to take a gander, probably 85% of this book is a flashback. Now, for people who were reading the series who wanted continuation of the series back at the time that it released, especially given that the Wastelands ended basically right in the middle of the climax. It was a really weird place to cut the story. The fact that most of Wizard and Glass was a flashback after, finishing the climax to the Wastelands, all things considered, people who weren't wanting or weren't expecting the flashback, this was kind of a meh thing. But for those who either didn't care or who were looking forward to Roland eventually telling his backstory, since multiple times throughout the first, well, not necessarily the first three books, but at least in books 2 and 3, a couple times he references like, no, we'll talk about later when we're ready for that. This was a great part of the book for many people. I tend to fall in the latter end of that spectrum. I was looking forward to Roland's backstory, and it kind of helped that I knew well before I read the book, even before I started the series, that Wizard and Glass was mostly flashback. I was actually expecting more of it to be a flashback, but because I was expecting this and wanting it, I fell on the side that I really enjoyed the book overall. My general opinion is that Wizard and Glass is my favorite of the Dark Tower books so far, and I say that having read 7 of the 8 of them. The only one that I haven't read yet at the time of recording is The Dark Tower, the title book of the series, and the finale. I doubt that this will change, especially given some of the mixed reception of the final book as well, but for completely different reasons. But let's go ahead and talk about why Wizard and Glass is my favorite book of the series so far. But right before we go into that, let me just preface this by saying, for reference, since I don't think I've mentioned this in any of the other Dark Tower reviews or even any other reviews in general, my reviewing this book, book 4 of the series, assumes that you've read previous entries. If you are watching this review and haven't read up to, or rather up through, the Wastelands yet, go do that, because there's high chances that in later reviews of the series, I may spoil or talk about rather freely certain things that occur in earlier entries that you should probably have read up to. This review for Wizard and Glass is going to be spoiler free, but that does not mean that I'm not going to spoil things about the Wastelands or Drawing of the Three. I could, probably won't, but it depends on the review. So with that going in, let's actually now talk about my favorite parts of Wizard and Glass. Now, this first thing isn't necessarily something that I loved as much as most other people did, but the conclusion to the arc of the Wastelands is very satisfying for most people. The Wastelands basically ends like right in the middle of the climax, and all things considered, it ends like right at the peak of what's supposed to be the climax. The very like actual climactic moment of that book, or at least what should be for that book, actually occurs in part 1 of this book here. The Wasteland ends right before the riddle contest with Blaine the Train. Honestly, I wasn't a fan of that ending because it wasn't an ending. I talked about this in the Wastelands review, but for this reason, it makes people happy that part 1 of this book, right around 150 pages or so, finishes off this scene and then immediately goes into Roland's flash story after that. Given different pacing and stuff like that, I would have wished for part 1 of this book to be at the end of the Wastelands instead, but that's something we can discuss a little bit later. But speaking of the flashback in general, given that it's the majority of the book, like I said, it's probably 80 or 85% of the entire story, it's amazing. My single favorite section of the entire series is parts 2 and 3 of this book that cover some of Roland's past. King's masterwork in character writing is on full display here. His masterful ability to build small towns is on display, and even the conflict within the small towns is also there in the book. It's kind of hard to talk about some of these things without going into spoilers, but everything that makes up this flashback for me worked so well. There are some people who really don't like the flashback, and that's why they don't like Wizard and Glass very much. I haven't encountered very many of those people yet, personally. Because if you're a fan of King's character work, and you're a fan of his ability to write small towns, this book has that in droves with Roland's character as a younger kid. Not necessarily a kid, but he's like a preteen teenager. Not preteen. He's like a young teenager in the flashback of this book. And King just writes it so well. It is so, so good. Even the very end of the tale was incredible to me, as bittersweet as it was, because the end of the flashback is rather depressing. In a weird way, a lot of, not necessarily a lot of why it hit so hard because King just wrote it so well in the first place. Part of why it hit so hard, though, was because I found a lot of parallels with it, with a relationship that I experienced a little bit earlier in my life. This is somewhat spoilery-ish in terms of context, but also not really. The whole young teenage love and the way that that can blind a person, the consequences of being a stupid teenager, those kind of themes and topics that King covers in this whole flashback, and particularly closer to the end, just it all really hit home in a powerful way for me. The more that I talk about this book, actually, and the flashback in general, the more that I connect to it and realize how good it is and how important it is for me. So not only is it just really good in the way that it's written and what it does, it just connects with me personally as well. In fact, I would say that it connected with me so well to a point that I would say that I'm actually pretty likely to come back to parts 2 and 3 of this book a few times over the years in the future, even if I don't reread the entire series, because parts 2 and 3, as Roland's Past, are kind of disconnected enough from the rest of the series that they're just kind of their own thing and kind of act as what could potentially be a book in and of itself. It just would need a little bit more context for that. But yeah, whether I reread the whole series or not doesn't really matter to me. I guarantee that I'll come back to these two parts at some point someday. Also, there was some very cool stuff in the book in part 1 of it that has a couple multiverse connections that even I'm aware of, being somebody who hasn't read that much King, that start to make themselves, appear and apparent in the book. And there are some cool references as well at the end with some more IRL things. The ending in total was very cool too. Part 4 was rather short, but it does finally start to hint at some things to come, which is very exciting, especially for those who do want to continue on with the main story of the series. But now we kind of come to where we need to talk some of the worst elements of Wizard of Glass. Now, I've already mentioned this a few times, and I talked about this in the last Dark Tower review as well. Even with all the gushing, and as 5-star a book this is, and rightly deserves to be, I do have one, kind of two, but mostly just one major problem with it. I mentioned how part 1 is 150 pages, finishing the arc at the end of the Wastelands. This is my major problem. Like 100% of part 1 of Wizard and Glass could have been, and I think definitely should have been, at the end of book 3 instead. Like, I'm not necessarily trying to be too hard on King, but there's like next to no reason why at least 60 to 75% of book 1 couldn't have been in book 3, preferably all of it. Like, this would have made book 3 better. I think it would have made book 4 better than it already is. It would have dampened most of the complaints about the book in the beginning of this book in the beginning, with people who didn't want or weren't expecting the flashback, and people who were complaining about the end of the Wastelands, and even some people now to an extent. Like, just imagine if Wastelands ended with the riddle that everybody loved, and then at the very end of the Wastelands, it had the whole quartet sitting down and rolling saying, "This is my story," or something like that. And the expectations for both this book and people complaining about the end of the previous book just it would have been so much better set. The expectations would have been better, and I think overall reception would have been better in both cases. I knew that this book was basically a long flashback going into it, like I said, but if I hadn't, I don't know how I would have felt about it. So there were definitely some problems with this. Just, it could have been organized a little bit better, and it would have made both of these really good books even better somehow. Now, coming to the end of this review, I will say that I was rather tentative going into this book before I started it, but I am so glad that I enjoyed it as much as I did, because it definitely made me really excited to continue, though I will say it didn't make me so excited to continue the main story that I wasn't willing to do Win Through the Keyhole next, and that's going to be the next Dark Tower review as well. Expect a review of that in 2 weeks, I believe. Given that at this point I've read all of the Dark Tower books except for the finale, I'm very excited to cover more of these books in reviews for you guys, so I hope you stick around for those. Next week, I'm covering The Andromeda Evolution by Daniel H. Wilson, which is a sequel to Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain, which I have covered on the channel before as well if you want to check out that video. Otherwise, I think this is all that I've got for this review today. Just as always, check out seasonalproductions.com for all of my video and writing all in one place. I did renovate it a couple months ago, so I hope you enjoy the new design as well. Other than that, thank you guys for watching. I'll be back again next week with the next episode of the Book Binge.